you're going to see why natural law is incomplete to Naturosophy, a philosophy I developed to further ground and create a holistic worldview upon the idea of nature. And so we are going to break this down using natural law slides by Mark Passio and seeing what else could be complemented to it. Now bear in mind that this presentation could be expanded upon greatly in many different ways, but in particular I'm going to be applying it in the context of Naturosophy so you can see where the differences or contrasts may be. In particular, what lives at the heart of natural law, that being morality and rights. So that will be the most important concept, but nonetheless, we still have to look at the prerequisites and surrounding conditions, which the original presentation covers quite well. So we're just going to maybe see if we can make it even more holistic than it already is in its knowledge. But before we begin, I want to talk about the common misconceptions about the idea of nature. If you say to anyone that nature is good in any way, there's two misconceptions they will make. And they will say, well, what about other animals and what about our instincts? And so when we look at just our instincts, we're not looking at our whole nature. If somebody says, well, somebody can do this hard thing and it's natural, it comes natural to them and therefore, they do it, but that doesn't make it good. Well, I agree. I mean, yes, it's instinct, and they're not using their intuition or their other senses, and you recognize and know that it's wrong for them to do that. How do you know that? Clearly, you're using something other than instinct, so instinct is not the only thing in your being. So to limit nature, or the conception of nature being good, to the mere matter of instinct is to essentially limit the idea of nature and the whole of what makes up a human being. So you'd be basically asking for ignorance on part of making this conception. And the same thing goes when people make comparisons between human beings and other animals, because frankly, the simple truth to this as well is that we're not other animals. We're our own species. It's not us. And so although, if you want to look at it from the macro worldview, we all are same species or in the same reality, we also then have different environments that we live in, different bodies, different diets. And this can be considered among difference, but seeing the difference and then seeing where we're similar, these you can say is time and place. Understanding when we're similar, when we're different, when we should use instinct, when we should not. And this helps us understand what we should do with our own nature. And if we know what to do with our own nature in relation to the nature of the world, as we would be doing so, we would be harmonizing with nature. Therefore, nature can be seen as good so long as we have the knowledge to harmonize with it. But in case that doesn't make enough sense for you, already just summarizing that briefly, I'm going to break it down using this presentation. So let us begin. In his starting slides, he talks about the different disclaimers he wants to make, how you should not judge his appearance and set things aside from the speaker. The whole seminar works together. It's a holistic blueprint that is all connected, one and another. So I'm going to skip all this. Teachabilities, basically you don't want to be too closed-minded or open-minded. Very important that people consider their sources of information, because if information is limited, they can be easier controlled, or ignorance is going to take place more often. And of course, there's requirements for what we say we want, and therefore we must know those requirements in order to actually manifest them, have them put into action. Now, the first slides we're going to be going over here in relation to Naturosophy is occult knowledge. So when we talk about the occult, the word occult simply means hidden. And on the slide, it claims that occult knowledge constitutes both the knowledge of human consciousness and how it operates and the knowledge of natural law. And saying that essentially natural law is an occult concept. Okay, so this is where it's very interesting because you need to be able to see many different perspectives. Of course, I hope that you watched the presentation by Mark Passio before watching this, and I would recommend it to people. because it helps provide a worldview. Even if you don't agree with it, at least see it for what it is. It is changing a lot of people's lives. I mean, I interviewed over 50 different people for the End of Slavery Summit, and you can see from their personal testimonies, wow, it was powerful. It was changing lives. And so here we have an interesting concept, because in this part of the presentation, we're not talking about statism yet, which is this belief system or superstition that people have, but they don't know about. So you can consider statism equally as occult as natural law. In fact, you may not even need to mention natural law, because statism is man's law. And if you take that out of the equation, what you're left with is natural law. Now, inversely, you can say, well, by understanding natural law, you can get rid of man's law, okay? So it works both ways. It's like understanding what is wrong to know what is right, or right for wrong, etc. Right? So if we're saying natural law is hidden, well, what about statism? And not a lot of people know about this belief system, but most people do know basic morals. And if most people know that it's wrong to harm another person, or it's wrong to steal, what's really hidden here, if that's the heart of natural law? Natural law isn't hidden. It's simply there's a contradiction in the conscience of the masses that is keeping them in their belief system of statism, in their superstition. So rather than looking at this through a hidden worldview, we can say there's a contradiction in the psyche of the populace, where people don't realize they're supporting immoral actions while knowing what is actually immoral. They don't equate government to those concepts. They don't apply their concepts of morality to authority. And so this can be going onto the edge of complicating the basics with doctrine and distracting from statism. Because when you start mentioning there's these spiritual laws and consciousness and occult concepts, you may not be talking about this one core belief system. Now, you can get your way there, like I mentioned, but it can tend to complicate some of the basics, like I said, which is most people already know what is right and wrong. So it's not really hidden, it's simply being contradicted. Okay, and so then if we move on from here, we have nescience and ignorance. Now, the reason why we have to talk about this slide is because they're basically one and the same. It's the context of not knowing, it says. And if you don't know, you're ignorant. So nescience is just another form of ignorance. Because let's say you don't know something, it's absent or unattainable. You're still ignorant of the fact that there is knowledge there. Or that there's knowledge, and you say, oh, well, it's not there, it's absent. Well, if it wasn't there, then it wouldn't be knowledge, something to attain in the very first place. We are ignorant. If anything, we don't know. And so ignorance, we say we don't want to know, and Easton says we don't know. Either way, we don't know. It's ignorance. And this is why, Socrates said, the only good is knowledge, the only evil is ignorance. He didn't say the only evil is ignorance or nescience, because the truth is everywhere around you. The truth just is. So clearly the knowledge is. Okay, if we're acknowledging there is such a thing as knowledge, then there's no such thing as the absence of it. It's all there for you to see, just a matter of perspective for you to take it in. It took several hundred years, thousands of years to get a microscope to see something new that has always been around us. But, it took some evolution to get there, but it was already there. So you can say it was absent in our minds, but it was actually present, and we just needed to find the way to get there. Maybe there were people who were ignorant who said, man, no, we'll never get there, we'll never be able to see it. And that's what's keeping them from the knowledge, because the knowledge point of view would say, wait, there is always more to this world, there's always more to figure out. This is why we embrace that position of ignorance to say, yeah, we are all ignorant, because we all need to continually learn to get better at our knowledge. Okay, so then from here, we can ask our question, why? Why is the world the way it is? Right? And there's a level of problem solving that we can do for this, which is recognizing there is a problem, and we have to take the necessary action in order to diagnose the causes of the problem. Truth is objective, this slide states, and if we say it's objective, and we say that it simply is what is and always is, that is basically nature. If you know from Naturosophy, I define what is natural as what has always existed. And what is natural is considered of nature. So you can say truthful is what is of truth, or what is real is of reality. In the same way, you can say what is natural is of nature. And so when we are trying to align to what has always been, and what is, and we're aligned to truth and nature and reality and health, all the words I equate together, honesty and honest, right? So these are basically the ties that we can understand within Naturosophy. And if we are to compare truth versus perception, it's the same thing as saying knowledge versus ignorance as well. Because our perception is bound to ignorance in the sense that we always need to learn. So we're not perfect. We don't have all the knowledge in the world. There's always more knowledge to obtain. So in a sense, you could say we're always ignorant or always nascent. We're always ignorant because it's the same thing essentially. And this is just knowledge versus ignorance. What do we know? What do we know for sure? And even then, it's like, do we really know it for sure? So we want to be as accurate as possible. It's about accuracy. So truth versus perception is the same thing as knowledge versus ignorance, because knowledge is what helps us understand the truth, and our perception is basically bound to ignorance, and that's why we have to constantly look toward the truth or knowledge. Okay, so our perception is not a bad thing, but our perception needs to work with the truth or reality or nature. Okay, if you're not able to use these interchangeable words, you are stuck in a doctrine-based system, not able to look at the whole holistic worldview. And of course, there's a quote about how people filter reality through their own perception. And of course, most naturally, because you are an individual in this world, you're going to filter things through your own perception. The question is, do you want to limit it there? And that's where we have solipsism come in. And basically, when you combine that idea of denial plus solipsism, if you're saying, well, my mind is the only thing that exists, and I deny the fact that there's any other minds out there, and that there's no such thing as truth or nature or reality, you basically are asking for ignorance. You don't want to see anything outside of the self. You don't want to see anything in your reality that might contradict your current worldview. Okay, so now if you look at definitions, it means to get more accurate, meaning, clarity, which is exactly what we're doing with perception and truth, as we mentioned before, knowledge and ignorance. Okay, and natural law is defined, natural being inherent, having a basis in nature, reality, and truth, not caused or created by mankind. Again, if you were to interchange this definition with what has always existed, it applies exactly the same. It's inherent. It's what was given, basically, to you. And it's not made or caused by humankind because it was long before humankind even came here. It has a basis in nature because natural stands for of nature. So law, an existing condition which is binding and immutable, basically the same exact thing as the word natural. Because you can't escape nature. It's binding upon you. And it's immutable, meaning it cannot be changed because you didn't create nature. Because you're not God. You're not nature itself. You're part of nature. You're within nature, but you're not nature itself. Right? And same thing, like, again, comparing ourselves to other animals. We are not other animals, and those other animals are in nature. Together we make up nature, but even together we have to still consider the plants and the elements and everything else that consist of us. Right? And then you could say, oh, well, we're all vibration, and still make a universal statement like that. But there's still so many complex elements to this reality. Do we want to sit still and say this is what it is? No, we want to constantly improve and constantly look out for that knowledge. So natural law is essentially just nature. Basically, because when I broke down the definitions, natural and law basically mean the same thing, and natural just means of nature. And nature, since you can't escape it, governs everything. It's something that you have no choice but to be governed by. And it governs everything, meaning not just actions. So when people usually use the words natural law, they're usually limiting it to actions and morality. Morality is actually naturality in Naturosophy, because you have to be able to recognize that nature is in control of everything. Not that you aren't in control of your life, or that you aren't part of nature, as I said. It's about understanding our time and place within nature so we can work with it. Okay, so with the government of the world, of God, of nature, that's what you're working with. Okay, so natural law is simply just nature, and if you want to get more specific, natural moral law is the natural, understanding what aligns to nature in our actions and how we can better ourselves, because now you're adding morality to the equation. But many people, when they say natural law, they're usually referring to just actions and morality, which is usually considered natural moral law. Okay, his working definition, universal spiritual laws governing the dynamics of consciousness, a bit more complicated. I think when it comes to the idea of consciousness, and there's a lot of scientific studies still being conducted on consciousness to this day, even though it goes back thousands of years. Ken Bartle is a good resource for understanding more about consciousness. But again, this is just nature. It governs everything. Discovery versus belief. Belief is essentially not knowledge, so it's irrelevant. Again, I'm summarizing these slides through the concept of ignorance versus knowledge, and you can see I can do this with pretty much everything. Belief is not knowledge, otherwise it would be knowledge. If you're believing in it, then you don't really know. Okay, and so that sums up that concept. Now, if we're looking at consciousness and brain structure, now, regardless of whatever you think about this, because there are a lot of controversies regarding this science of the left versus right brain, look at the concepts for what they are and see how they relate, how true they stand in reality just through the concepts alone. And what you will find out is that you can't just limit this perspective to the left and right brain. There's also chakra systems. There's also the yin and the yang in the Taoist symbol. The Tao is what it's called, the way, right? So if you were to look at this left and right brain as the yin and yang, or masculine and feminine, or different types of chakras and parts of the universe working in harmony together, you don't have to just limit it to this particular way of looking at things, okay? I think Taoism does a great job of describing the polarities and ironies, and Tao Te Ching is a good book for describing that, because a lot of what people will read in there is like, wait, that sounds ironic, that doesn't make sense at first. I mean, you will even watch Star Wars and Yoda's like, use the Force, but the Force means just let go, stop asking questions, just let go, just use the Force. Use the Force by letting go, not using anything, just letting it be. Isn't that interesting? But that's how the way works, because nature simply is. So when you let go and embrace the natural world heals itself in the same way you might fast in the body. Let things be, live and let live, which is essentially the basis of all this morality, right? And so when we understand that there's mind control in the brain, going back to this slide, there's a mental schism, right? And when we're ignorant of the whole, being both sides of the brain, or all chakras, or all systems, the yin and the yang, yes, we're going to be mind controlled because we are ignorant. And what does whole mean? If I were to break it down and say, wow, what if we understand the whole of something? Well, whole is just another word for health, and health is just another word for nature. So we wouldn't be seeing all the knowledge that consists of nature. Now, if we understand this slide, natural law plus free will, what we have, natural law just being nature, free will is human beings, human nature, you have nature plus humans. Nature plus humans helps us understand the truth. We wouldn't even have a concept of truth if it weren't for humans observing an ever-present nature to then understand what knowledge they need for their own actions. So truth or knowledge is nature, because that is what they're seeking out of nature in the very first place. That's how you even have a concept of nature. That's how you even make an appeal to nature. That's how you even have a concept of morality, of saying there is a standard in nature. Okay, so this is all very, very important. And when we want to look at human nature, say, man, are we demonic or are we angels? Some people will say this is sin versus not having sin. Well, we are programmable, much like machines, which is why people are getting their reality mixed up with AI, because it's basically feeding off of our reality. It's dependent upon the natural reality, which makes natural intelligence more important than artificial intelligence. I have a whole chapter about that in Sapientia Naturae. But when we look at quality, that is essentially nature plus natures, understanding how the natures react with one another, because change is law. Okay, people are going to change. Things in the universe are going to change. And people will often say this, change is law. You're not going to stop change. And I think this is the beauty as well as to why a lot of the man-made systems and laws don't work. I mean, you even see AIs challenging all of it. And God forbid we get flying cars. I mean, there goes all the traffic laws, right? But when you have this innovation and this constant change, it challenges every structure that wants to fit everything into a box and say this is the way nature must be. Because we have potential to do so much in this world. And so understand that change is essentially part of this reality, that natures are going to react and interact with one another. So you have the culture and the behavior and the life and the information, the transformation ultimately. Okay, and so when we then understand how our reality is built, it's basically how much we learn for aligning to nature. Because again, nature is the given, so when we start from the very bottom, which is knowledge, understanding wisdom, which is what we use knowledge for, then we're basically all the matter of understanding our alignment to nature. So from the very bottom we have ourselves, and at the very top we have nature. And getting closer to it, our manifested reality, reality just being another word for nature, manifested nature, manifested natural reality, it's about us aligning to it with our information, our knowledge, making sure that it's knowledge through decision making, through our behavior, through seeing our effects of our actions, through learning overall. Because we may think something is true and then find out it's not true, because time tells us all truths. We learn through time, we act through time, and then we find our place through time. This is time and place. Now, if we are to move on to what Mark Passio calls the principles of natural law, which are actually just the Hermetic principles, I would consider natural law, again, nature being many different things, not limited to just this, very important. We have to understand that this is just a form of knowledge, having certain principles. But it's not limited to this concept we call natural law, and this is the problem of attachment. People will say, no, it's just these principles. This is what consists of the law, of the principles. There's no other principles. There's no other laws. This is what it is. Don't stay limited to your view of what is natural law, right? And again, we can simplify things without getting too complicated, but these principles generally have helped people see more to their reality, which is great. Of course, polarity, you can even see the yin-yang symbol. So Taoism is definitely a core part of this philosophy overall. And the plane of causality and effects, knowing the why versus the manifested reality, what comes from the why. And then we have the lost principle, which we have is the generative principle, care. Mark Passio states it's basically the creative principle, what allows us to create, because if we care about something, that is what we will then put into the world. But then right after those slides, he goes into spiritual currencies, which he says is time and attention. But clearly, because we mentioned that care is the binding principle and everything gets created from care, care is actually a currency. So we can say time and attention is currency, but you have to care enough to put attention into something, to give something your time. If I care about a certain plant in my garden bed, I'm going to give it more of my time and attention. but the care was essentially the real currency behind time and attention. So realize that part of that currency is care. But what allows you to care? Well, your nature, your being. You may not even be able to care or have empathy if you are a psychopath, or if you're somebody who lacks that ability, the simple ability. Now, maybe you don't want to say you lack it because you probably could have it, and maybe you've been suppressing it, as is most of the case when you're looking at things that denature. They're mostly just suppressing the natural functions that are still there. But if you're looking at care, it's still dependent on nature, nature's function, our ability to care. We're growing into a world where people don't have the ability to do simple things in their life. That can be very challenging. Okay, so very important we look at that. And we realize that we look at all virtues, right? All virtues, not just care, like honesty and respect, loyalty, understanding where do you put your loyalty, temperance, right? All these things, Aristotle had lists of virtues, are all connected. And without one or the other, what you have is an imbalance, okay? So this is us finding our place and not limiting our perspective, because somebody can agree with everything in natural law, say it's wrong to harm another person while they're harming themselves, while they're doing drugs or not realizing what they're doing to their own body. And yes, you might be ignorant of what is actually happening to your own body, and you might think it's actually healing you, but realize that you have to question to see, is it really? Because there might come a time and point where you really do have to question and say, what is affecting me? And it might have just been there all along, and you just didn't ask the right question. You didn't find the answer that was right in front of you. So this is why it's important to ask very important questions like that, which is reflecting upon your own reality. Only you can do that for yourself. So take the time and attention to do that, and you'll find your own care. You'll see why you care for certain things, what you're putting your care into, etc. Right? So again, quality of our attention affects our world in accordance with the principle of correspondence, how we have information that is being poured into us, and then there's not always the greatest information that is being given to us as well. And this all is determined by what individuals' filter or perception is going to then create the world. So very important that we then look at this. When we talk about quality and we talk about currencies, I do have a whole chapter dedicated to natural currency and then natural professions. And this is related as well to supply and demand in the free market, which is another thing not mentioned in this presentation, although closely connected. The idea that if there's a demand, there will be a supply. So if enough people care about a certain thing, so then there will be a supply, there will be a demand. Okay, so this is just mere economics, but that actually makes it real currency based on care, based on time and attention. So the free market is connected to these ideas. And let's understand that false knowledge is not knowledge. It's ignorance, because you recognize it as false. It's not something that you can learn from. Now, if it's something you say, wow, well, now I know this is not true, now that's knowledge if you want to look at it from the macro point of view. But if you're attaching yourself to knowledge, thinking that it's knowledge, then you are basically ignorant. It's all being able to look outside, look at the bigger picture, okay? And so, how are we spending our time paying attention? Here we have the golden rule shared across every single tradition around the world. C.S. Lewis documents this quite well in his book, The Abolition of Man, where he also makes warnings to humanity about how they will abolish themselves if they don't have simple traditional morality, the first platitudes, the practical reason, first principles. It's been called many other names, not just the ones that are on this slide. But here are many of similar names that have been used throughout history to essentially say the same thing, that you are part of nature. That's basically what they're saying. And that you have to work with it and the whole. Okay? Because by working with it, you are working with the whole. You understand it because the whole is just health. Health is just another word for nature. And you are part of that nature. So if you want to fulfill your life within it and basically fits your puzzle piece into the puzzle with harmony, with perfection, you have to perfect it. You have to know the pieces. You have to be able to fit into that world. This is why we have to say, okay, wait, we don't want to fit in with the world, but maybe we want to fit in with the natural world. We don't want to have a man-made government, but maybe we want a natural government. And really, it's not really a government. Really, it's not really conformity. Really, it's not really authority, right? So then we have to look at the natural law expressions. Of course, there's love, there's fear, there's knowledge, there's ignorance. And then, notice he has a lot of quotes about ignorance, sovereignty, and then we have confusion, freedom, control, order, and chaos, right? So, let me switch to this. Freedom, control, sovereignty, confusion, these are all basically inverses of one another. So one is positive and one is negative. You need to understand that, again, the requirement for love is nature. Whereas if you're in fear, you're not going to use your nature. You're just going to let things go in places where you're not in control anymore. Your nature can belong to someone else, essentially. And that's why they can control you. And that's why you're going to be ignorant. And that's why you're not going to work with nature so much. Because you're in fear. If you were to walk outside every day in fear, you wouldn't do anything. If you were fearful of stepping on a bug or walking out in nature or building a hut or anything, of using your own nature, you would not progress at all and harmonize with the natural universe, with your own human nature, because you have the ability to love, you have the ability to not be fearful, but you choose to be fearful. Maybe you don't even choose that because fear is more on the instinctual side, and love requires maybe some courage, getting out of that fear. Right? So this is a practice that we have to attain for ourselves. Some people have to meditate. They have to deep breathe, especially in today's world, because there's a lot of things pushing them down to their animal instincts so they can't be anything more than just that, so they can be controlled. But this is understanding nature for nature, love for knowledge, knowledge for sovereignty, nature for love, nature for knowledge. Without nature, you have no roots to any of this. Okay, all of care and love is essentially the idea of nature is the answer. The whole message that I share, nature is the answer, is the idea of respect. Respecting the natural universe and saying it is the answer is to imply that you care for it and that it is something that you say this is what we should look up to. And so if you know the source and if you're looking up constantly toward the source that you know, then all the answers will come from there, being that nature is the prerequisite for love, knowledge, sovereignty, freedom, and order. And being that nature is the only order that there ever can be because it is order, and every order that man tries to attempt is not so great unless it works with nature, then nature is essentially that government, like we mentioned before. And you can look at fear as basically a lack of embrace of nature, or the Tao, because the Tao would say, relax, just let things flow, let things be, and you actually become freer by letting things go, okay, and embracing things as is. But you cannot embrace or love something. Love and embrace are two very similar words. If you are in fear, because you're going to be like, I want to get away from this, I can't deal with this, right? So you're not really embracing it. You're not really loving it. If you love nature, you have to embrace it. No matter all the dangers you want to say are dangers, that's just going to give yourself fear, because if they're dangers that are naturally inherent in nature, they're not a danger only if you are ignorant of them. They're only a danger if you don't recognize they're a danger and you are ignorant or you choose to partake in that and then you complain. That's still your fault. It's not nature's fault for your own ignorance. And I cannot stress that more than enough, because people will still say nature is evil. No, it isn't. Nature just is. It's evil because you're ignorant of what is evil in nature. So, nature, or nature is the answer, is essentially the path toward knowledge. And whereas if we were to say man is the answer, or denaturing, is essentially the path toward ignorance. Okay, because if you're saying we can just change this reality and denature, change anything we want, we're ignoring the fact that there is an underlying reality, something that is always there for us to understand. We're saying we can be God, we can be nature, ignoring the nature that was there, that created us, that was before us, that allows us to live. And so this is, the whole idea of transhumanism, essentially, the idea that we can just take over and change everything. Okay, so we cannot. We have to understand our time and place. We can work with it, we can create things, but it has to still work in harmony with nature. Or at least we have to understand what it is doing so we maintain our nature. So, essentially, you can't leave it. You can't escape it. You can't ignore it. And if you're not ignoring nature, then you have knowledge of it. And so, you have the ignorance quote that was mentioned before, which is, it expects what never was and never will be. Well, the man-made. Let's think about the man-made, because the man-made is not always talked about. It's not talked about at all in this presentation, other than in the context of law. But anything that is man-made is essentially an illusion, something created from something that is once natural. Okay, it was changed in form. Never was and never will be. We create all sorts of words and numbers and ideas, but nature just is. It doesn't have to perverse a tree into a certain type of symbol, an ideology, or a simple mere piece of paper into an ideology, or this or that. It doesn't have to be more than what it already is. Man takes it and complexifies it to his own whim. And so he takes what never was and never will be. This is what he attempts to create. And then the other quote that Mark Passio mentions is, they will sink under their own weight. What does that mean? Sink under their own weight. That is self-denaturing. That is karma. Right? And so, if we understand that the man-made will ultimately come to our own self-destruction, that's because we don't recognize something higher beyond that. That is the prerequisite to that very thing in the first place. If you want to maintain that thing, it has to work with the natural environment. You have to recognize the natural environment. You have to know its time and place. Okay, so again, the only good is knowledge, the only evil is ignorance. And this debunks politics as a whole. But let us understand the importance of knowledge and ignorance, because it's only one part of this slide. Realize that even understanding love is a sense of knowledge. Knowledge and love is one and the same. Fear and ignorance is one and the same. Confusion, fear, and ignorance, they're all one and the same on these charts. You can say, yeah, you can make a path downward, but if you're wrapped in confusion, you have trauma within yourself, you're going to have fear as you get older. You're going to want to remain ignorant as you get older in certain ways, unless you start going to the other side and embracing knowledge and sovereignty and freedom. These are all one and the same, and this is why when you start to embrace one, you start to embrace the other. They're correlated and connected. So when I say the only good is knowledge, that holds true, even if you said the only good is love. It's the same thing, because what are you loving? What are you giving your care to? It has to be towards something. Knowledge of what? What is the knowledge of? It's of nature, right? So our nature, okay, if it's known, that's sovereignty, okay? Because now we have freedom. We understand who we are meant to be. We're saying we're not supposed to be slaves. Let's say it's unknown. Okay, well, I guess we can have slaves. I guess we can do this, we can do that. It's confusion. No one knows who they are. Well, now they're controlled. They're controlled by their own impulses. They're controlled by other people because of that. And they don't know themselves or what to do. And what you end up is with chaos, is because no one knows what they're doing. They're creating things they don't know. They're attempting things that can definitely go wrong because they have no knowledge behind their actions. So of course that's chaos, right? So in a sense, if I were to summarize order and chaos very simply, order is you belong with you. This is balance. This is justice, because this is time and place in their correct being. You belong with you. Whereas chaos, it's not. You don't belong with you, which is untrue. But to attempt to would be to create chaos, because you can't undo that. You can't undo the fact that you belong with you. So you're basically violating time and place and creating an imbalance, an injustice, right? You can call that wrong. You can call that dishonest. It is dishonest because you recognize you do belong with you. You can attempt otherwise, but it's not going to last long. Okay? At least unless it's going to come to your own demise, or you have to create a whole man-made system in order to make it seem like it looks legitimate. So man will attempt to denature reality and mask all of reality in order to make that denaturing look legitimate. That's exactly what government does, and I detail in my Government is Unnatural book. So let's get to the heart of natural law, essentially, which is probably what's really, really important for this presentation. What is right is what it supports and gives to the natural. Okay, and then what is wrong violates and or steals from the natural. This is the real definition for naturosophy. Whereas in natural law, right is something that does not result in harm to other sentient beings. Wrong results in harm to other sentient beings. Now, Mark Passio has several other ways of saying this. He says a wrong is also a form of theft, steals property, it's a form of violence, okay? Whereas a right does not. And so every time he mentions right, he's saying it's not a wrong. But I'm specifically saying that a right supports and or gives to the natural. Because if you're not stealing from somebody, you're actually giving to them. You're allowing them to live. You're giving to their ability, their natural nature, which is to persist in existence. The same way you say, well, by self-defending or defending somebody against an aggression, against harm, I'm helping their nature. Yeah, you're supporting them, you're giving them what belongs, which is their nature intact to themselves. And so what is wrong would essentially violate or steal from, okay? Now, violate and or steal, okay? This is not necessarily one and the same because, again, we're not applying this to just actions to other people, like stealing. You can steal from yourself in a sense of saying, well, you're not allowing yourself to do certain things that you know you should do, or you are giving your body things that you know you shouldn't do, or maybe you don't know. You are violating your nature by giving yourself poisons, essentially. Say this is in a regular food supply too, there's plenty of chemicals and heavy metals, stuff like that. So understand that what is right in their naturosophy supports and or gives to the natural. In other words, what is real is what supports reality. And you can say right is what is rightful, is what supports right. Like I said before, truthful supports truth. Wrongful supports what is wrong. Righteous supports what is right. These are all just different words of the same concept. So realize there's other words you can use for right, like honesty and real and natural. But I am saying what is natural is what is right, because even Mark makes this claim on the slide. He says what is correct is also what is moral. And if it's correct, meaning it's based in nature, it's natural, then what is natural is what is moral. And so he's saying what is natural is what is right. Whereas what is wrong would have to be what is unnatural, because it's not based in nature. So what is it based in? It's based in an illusion. It's based on what people think they can do, and that's why it's all relative, moral relativism, subjective, because it's man-made. So when we look at right and wrong through this context of naturosophy, you can see the worldview expands. And we're not just saying a right is not a wrong, we're saying it supports and or gives to the natural, what has been there, the body per se. You can say, okay, we have natural rights. We're going to get into that concept as well, because we're going to be talking about knowing rights and apophatic, right? Apophasis means affirmation through negation. If we look at a multiple choice question and we say, man, all these answers are wrong and therefore this one must be right. Well, what about no apophasis? What if we weren't to use apophasis, like in the case of naturosophy? We don't need apophasis. The truth is, it goes both ways. You can affirm through negation and negate through affirmation, because you can think something is right and end up being wrong. So apophasis can be inversed, and it still applies the same way. So affirmation through negation, realizing what something is by realizing what it is not. There's many times you're going to be fooled by thinking something is, even though you think you went through the process of apophasis. And then you have to go through apophasis again because you were still wrong. So you have to be able to realize that apophasis can be inversed and still apply, that you are negating through affirmation as well. Meaning you can learn what is right from what is wrong, you can learn what is wrong from what is right. Both ways. Again, this is the Tao, the yin and the yang working together, helping you find that balance, that middle ground, finding that justice. Okay, so you have the natural law of transgressions, harmful actions. It's limited to just actions. It's limited to just ideas of property here. But there's much more than this, okay? If we look at transgressions, these transgressions right here, what are the opposites of this? Well, if you're not murdering, what are you doing? You're creating life. If you're not raping, you are consenting. You are having boundaries, right? If you're not trespassing, you have consciousness. You know where you're going. Again, consent. Going back to the idea of consent and voluntarism, you can tie into this greatly. Honesty goes into the idea of lying. Lying is the opposite of honesty, and people will consider that a harmful action, right? In natural law, people add to this list. They say lying is another one. And so sharing is also the opposite of theft, right? So if you just look at the opposites of these, you can say, wait, there's transgressions, but then there's also opposites. So although these are wrong, there's also right actions. Now, you might say there's a lot more right actions than wrong actions. Great. Sure, but there's also a lot more wrong actions in the case of applying it past just behavior to other people. Because let's say you do continual harm to yourself. You continually partake in a vice. You drink a lot of alcohol, you do a lot of drugs. By not having temperance over your own self, you might end up harming someone in the long run. You might end up going so crazy to the point where you can't reason anymore. You don't have any knowledge for yourself that you do end up harming someone else. Now, you can call this utilitarian. You can say there's a bunch of problems with this because it's not direct. And I understand that. So generally, this graph, this slide is good. I mean, most people can agree with this. These are direct actions that can be seen. And so they can definitely be dealt with, right? Whereas the other things like vices, everybody's got a vice of some kind. It's all just a matter of keeping that controlled by ourselves. And that might require a health coach. That might require somebody, an outsider, to help us keep ourselves intact. Okay? Continual improvement of our own knowledge, of our own being. So realize all the wrongs connect. I mean, look at these. These are all forms of ignorance, of ignoring someone else's being. Because would you want the same thing being done to you? I don't think you would. And so let's not just limit our ideas to crimes. Let's also look at vices. Let's not limit our ideas to wrongs. Let's look at what's right. And let's not limit our ideas to just actions. Let's look at our individual actions and things that will also spill into the actions that affect other people. So the core concept here is also time. And I'm mentioning this because this is also important. So before we continue here, the concept of time is important because it teaches us the lessons of loss. In Naturosophy, I talk about this, the lessons of loss. If we look at the future, right? Our future is our life. And to lose our life is to lose our future. To lose our liberty is to lose our present. And to lose the product of liberty in life is to lose our past we have created for ourselves. I got this from a little presentation called The Philosophy of Liberty. Okay, it was an animation. It was redone several times, a very old classic on the internet. And I like the way it describes it because it's looking at everything through the concept of time, life, liberty, and liberty and life together, the product of those, which you're going to say likely is property. As you can see on the slide, it says life is a form of property, rights are a form of property, freedom is a form of property. But do you ever connect the idea of time to these? Because it takes you time to labor, to attain property, or to have yourself, your being, to reason for yourself. Time is in all these proceedings, and they're very, very important. Okay, so realize that your past is going to help determine the present and the future. It's going to determine what property you currently have. And so when we talk about the idea of birthrights, right? Birthrights, something that you were born with. You have the right to yourself. It's a birthright, we say. It's because it is the product of liberty in life. To lose your past, to lose your product of liberty in life is to lose your past, to lose who you're meant to be. Because nature is the ever-present. It's the infinity symbol I use. Again, it is what always has existed. So if you've always belonged to yourself, that's a birthright. If you've always had the ability to speak for yourself and breathe for yourself, that's a birthright. And then developing that and exercising that comes in time. As you realize, wait, these are rights and I have to maintain them. But what does that mean? These ideas of right. Well, we talked about a right before being what is correct or moral or natural, and we understand what is natural by knowledge, and we attain our knowledge over time. So as we grow, we understand our birthrights. We understand who we're meant to be and ever were being. We understand more about who we ever were in this life. We go back to the past so we can learn for our future and present. This is not repeating history, and this is understanding our sense of respect again. To look at these messages that are passed from generation to generation, to understand that nature is the answer. Because again, if you don't have life, that's murder. If you don't have liberty, that's slavery. If you don't have property, that's theft. And if you don't have murder, slavery, or theft, what you have is your nature still intact for yourself where they are supposed to be. And if you're saying there's a supposed, you're saying there's a right to them. So in the context of rights with an S, okay, what people call rights in quotes, the way it's defined in Naturosophy is an action that does not violate or that which constitutes one's nature. So rights are actions that do not violate or that which constitutes one's nature, which would make sense being that this is a dual, twofold, essentially, definition, okay? So actions do not violate. So if I say I breathe for myself, I have the right to breathe for myself, that doesn't violate my nature. In fact, it supports it because it constitutes my nature. So these two are connected. Okay, so by not stealing, you are giving, you are allowing. It's an action that does not violate, and it recognizes you do constitute your own nature. You do have the right to breathe for yourself because it is part of your nature. It's who you are. So it's both an action and a form of property. How can an action be a form of property? Well, it's because you have to be responsible for your actions. Your actions come from you. They're the product of you, and you own you. You, therefore, own your actions. Your actions were the product of what constituted your nature. Okay, so these are connected, these two definitions, to this one word we call rights. Nature cannot be changed or violated. It can only be attempted. So when we look at people saying, well, we can give rights to others that don't exist in nature, say that other people can rule over other people's lives, where do they get that right from? Where do they get the right to rule over other people's lives, tell them what to do with their own life and property? Well, they make it up. They attempt it. They believe they can do that. People will call this moral relativism. It's simply just an illusion. It's man-made. And it's man-made authority, to be more specific. And that is what taxation, prohibition, and permits are. And again, going back to the idea of statism, statism is the belief in authority. Okay, so you can look at this as well. Statism, however, also limits it to just a political worldview. Again, if we're looking at man-made authority as a whole, we're applying it to all man-made things and limiting our worldview to just those man-made concepts, to the man-made. Okay, so taxation, people can take your money. Prohibition, they can tell you what to put in your own body. Permits, you need to ask for permission to be free. Your nature is limited by another person. You are not free to express your nature. It doesn't belong with you. It makes them your authority. They're basically your master, and you are a slave. That's what happens in this case, right? But if you also just look at the thing, taxation, prohibition, or permits itself, without the authority behind it, you say, well, taxation is legitimate. You're giving that man-made concept authority over nature and the ideas that naturally belong. So you're putting authority in these ideas as well. So something important just to recognize. Okay, people are attempting to say that taxation is a thing. It isn't really a thing, right? There's only taking somebody's money or having your own money or voluntarily giving it away. There's no such thing as taxation. It's a word we made up just so we can make it sound legitimate that we can steal other people's money. But it's literally the same thing as theft. There's no difference in the action of it getting carried through into this reality. So therefore, it's just an illusion of a veil that we put on top of theft, saying that it's taxation. And the same thing with prohibition and licenses and permits. If they're just slavery, then that's what they are. No matter what words you want to use for it, it's still slavery. It's still theft. It's still taking from people and violating their nature. So, force versus violence. This can be semantics because people will use the perspective of aggression and use the perspective of harm, right? These are all different words, again, representing similar concepts. But I would hope people would just look past the semantics and understand what this chart is saying, because it's time and place of force and energy basically being applied here. If you're using your force and energy and you're not violating anybody else's being and their nature, then you understand a time and place of where to put your force and energy. And it's not violence. It's violence when you recognize, oh shoot, I shouldn't have put my energy or my time and energy, into this thing that I call murdering, this thing that is hurting someone. I recognize it's wrong to put my force and energy there, but it's right to put my force and energy into pushing a boulder up a mountain, right? So this is all the matter of learning time and place. Again, another concept. Now, if we are to go and move on to the two pillars, we have non-aggression and self-defense. However, there is a middle ground to this, as in the case of Taoism, a lot of philosophies as well, finding the balance between the yin and the yang. Again, we're looking into masculine and feminine here as well. What about non-resistance? Non-resistance would be in the middle here, because it's a form of self-defense that is also non-aggressive. It's being able to have the moral high ground and welcome an invader, and therefore not really instigate the invader into doing something more invasive. It's not adding fuel to the fire per se. It's understanding, again, time and place to know that you aren't just limited to self-defense. You can talk your way out of it. You can do other things. And you're still considering defense because you're giving something to them. Non-aggression, you're just letting people live alone. You're just living your life. Totally feminine. Masculine is, I'm going to take up arms, I'm going to end his life, or I'm going to do what I need to stop this. But what about that middle ground of, wait, we can talk to them, wait, we can reason, we can welcome them, say, hey, what's wrong? Why are you breaking into my house? Is there something you need? Could we get you a job? It would be a surprise. Rather, if you came out with a gun, you might surprise them. They might jump to action. It might get very nasty very quickly. It can become very traumatic. But you can change someone's life around right there in that moment. Rather than ending it, you might be able to save them. And if you don't have faith that you can save people, then it might be harder to get that more peaceful world. And so the non-resistant point of view comes a lot more from the abolitionists in the 1800s, which is why I mention it, because these individuals ended slavery, chattel slavery, and they used non-resistance often as a strategy to say, wait, we don't need to arm the slaves necessarily for their freedom. We can educate them and educate the slave masters, and eventually people will just let each other be. And if you don't think that's the case, well, see non-resistance in action. You can look at a lot of biblical scriptures as well. It says, resist not evil. And again, looking at Star Wars and all these movies and stuff, why do they talk about this as letting things be and not letting the force take you over? Having an instinct of wanting to do something is actually going to make you more evil than good. And then, you have all these people fighting overseas in countries they don't know, people they don't know. They think they're doing the right thing and they end up with this trauma. And no matter what, you pulling that trigger takes a lot of strength, a lot of courage, and it can still put an imprint on your life for the rest of your life. It's not your only option. So there's something to recognize that there's other options there. Don't steal, do give. Okay? So we talk about theft and ownership and how basically natural law can be summarized to don't steal, but it can also be summarized to do give. Because what are we doing right now? We're giving knowledge in order to know not to steal. We're basically always, if we're saying not stealing, we're giving, and if we're stealing, we're not giving. Okay, so they're always at play together in this universe, and if you don't see that relationship, it's like seeing wrong without right, or right without wrong, or yin without yang. We have conscience, which is knowing right and wrong, what to act on. Law of freedom. is basically nature, and that is the freedom given to us. Recognizing freedom and morality are directly proportional. Well, morality is naturality, what is natural. And freedom, well, nature and freedom is our natural condition. It's what is already here. So it's nature and natural are directly proportional. Of course it is, because natural is of nature. These are basically saying the same exact thing. Now, people don't always make this connection, but it's true. If freedom is our natural condition, and morality is what helps us understand what is natural to do within that natural condition, then yes, they work toward one another. They're directly proportional. They're basically the same thing. So our nature is our freedom given, and the natural is the morality. It's the giving, right? It's giving to the natural, whereas the freedom is the given reality. And so we're giving to our given by using morality for freedom, naturality for nature. Right? Naturality, just another word for morality, of course. And so man-made authority, again, is statism, whereas if we were to look at objective morality, which is what a lot of people will say is the difference between right and wrong, and knowing the difference between natural and unnatural, well, it's actually just natural authority. So if you replace the word objective with natural and morality with authority, it makes a lot of sense, because morality is a standard, a guideline, a way of living. So you're looking at saying this is the way you should be living your life. So morality is authority. And then objective, well, objective just means you can't change it. It's already there. Well, that's nature. So natural authority is objective morality. And what we know of natural authority is what has always existed. So we're looking up to what has always existed versus the man-made authority, which has not always existed, which is why governments rise and fall and are never stable and always end up in chaos. Okay? So natural law is just nature. And then man's law would have to be what? It has to be government, that which is trying to be nature, that of which is taking over natural authority. And so again, man's law is basically the opposite of natural law. It's based on ignorance. Natural law is based on knowledge. Right? And again, you cannot have a free world, a world that is ungovernable, unless you have knowledge. When you have knowledge, you're ungovernable because you govern yourself. And this is why knowledge is the prerequisite, required, the only one for freedom, as it is the only requirement for nature itself, or harmonizing with nature. So for all those people saying, man, we got to harmonize to nature, and they forget this core concept, and they don't look at government ever as taking over the place of nature, I think they're missing the entire picture of aligning to nature. So if we look at this if-then logic, basically it's understanding that if man's law goes against natural law, it's wrong, and if it is with natural law, well, then it's redundant, so natural law stays true no matter what and is the only law, essentially. Again, it's just nature. When we look at this, man is not dependent on man, okay? We can only guide. So, we have nature, which is there, and we have to respect that of each individual. We cannot say this is the authority over every individual, and you have to follow orders, and you have no choice. We can only guide each other. We're not dependent on one another for our existence, okay? We may say, well, we can help each other. Yeah, we can help each other in our existence, but they're not required for existence, okay? People will start to say, well, somebody's got to cook food for someone else. Someone's got to serve them at the restaurant. It's like they have choices not to do that. They can grow their own food. They don't need other people doing that food for them. And they can get help from them voluntarily. They don't need to be coerced into doing certain things. So man is not dependent on man. Man can only guide a fellow man. That's the only thing we can ever do. If we ever go beyond those boundaries and we say we can rule over and dictate and control others, we are actually, again, violating time and place. We are now taking the place of nature, which we shouldn't. Now, if we look at the concept of equality, how everyone has the same exact rights, well, equality is basically the capacity to know. And a lot of times you'll look at Mark Passio, he says, well, we are all in the capacity to understand right versus wrong, okay? And being that we're all in the capacity to understand that, then we're all in the capacity to exercise, equality, because we understand our rights, what is right versus wrong. essentially the same thing, as we all say. So if we have the capacity to know, we all have the capacity to know, then we all have the capacity to live and live with each other in harmony. And so this is what equality is, because you can claim all you want that everybody has the same rights, but not everybody's going to act morally, and not everybody's going to treat each other with fair respect to each other. So it's all understanding that we all have the capacity to do so, the capacity to work with each other, to know each other, to live with each other. And to know is to live, again, because you are harmonizing with nature. And let us remember that government is essentially the epiphany of man-made authority. It's going to say what rights people have without taking consideration of what knowledge, what nature lives there beyond what they simply just say. Okay? Because just because man says something does not make it true. Just because they write on a piece of paper does not make it true. That completely disregards nature and individuals learning for themselves. And this is why governments need to use schools in order to propagate and push ideas onto kids at a very young age. So, especially of authority, following orders. So if we're looking at government, and now we're finally getting into the idea of statism and the idea of authority, authority is just government. That is the concept of government, and it's man attempting to be nature itself, as I mentioned before. Again, looking in the context of Naturosophy, that is what authority is trying to do, because nature's authority is the only authority you really have to follow, that being your own conscience, that being the truth itself, reality, morality, naturality, whatever word you want to use for it, that you have to follow. So that is the real authority. But when man says you have to follow me and I am your authority, that's no different from slavery. And so that's why authority is just the concept of slavery, one way or another, because you're being told what to do with your own life or property. And if you weren't, and if it were voluntary, it would not be government. Just that simple. Now, the word religion is broken down here, which means religio, which means to connect, right? And so if we are to look at religions, the abolitionists in the 1800s who ended chattel slavery, a lot of them were quote-unquote religious. But that doesn't mean that you can't be religious without, following the state or the church. Doesn't mean that you can't have a spiritual practice or you can't be spiritual. It doesn't mean that you don't have morals. Okay, so all these concepts. Religio means to connect, okay? Religare means to tie back, to hold back, to thwart from forward progress. So maybe binding in the sense of connecting is not always a bad thing, because it brought a lot of people together in the 1800s and the 1700s. And that was a voluntary organization. And the way churches sort of built up with having certain people in certain places, it looked like a voluntary government, which made it just an organization. So let's be able to look at religion not just purely through a negative point of view, but also through the positive point of view and how it can connect people together, and that you might call true or natural religion or just spirituality. Now, the one true divide. The actual one true divide, as I have discussed here and have proven hopefully through this presentation, is actually between those of the natural and those of the unnatural. Essentially, those people who have knowledge of the natural versus those who partake in the illusion. Okay, so nature as government versus man as government, essentially. That's where you have the concept of statist versus anarchist. Okay, anarchy is just another word for nature. Okay, statism is essentially saying slavery is natural, and anarchist is basically saying freedom is natural, because freedom is nature. Are you going to say slavery is nature? I mean, you can't escape nature. So you're going to say you're a slave to it? Okay, but then if we say slavery is a man-made condition, then that completely changes that worldview, because, okay, that's basically saying man-made authority, man-made control is natural, which it is not. Because are you born with chains on? Are you born having to be controlled by another person? Well, we make it so through our belief systems, through our attempts, through our governments, but clearly those governments rise and fall. They're not permanent. They're not there. They're always having problems, and it's not something that nature created. So we can think all we want slavery is natural, or that, man-made control government is natural, but it isn't. So that is the belief in statism, is thinking government is natural, whereas anarchist says no. Nature is natural. Freedom is natural, because it is. Right, so Anarchy is basically nature, and nature is reality because it means no rulers, no masters. And there's rules. There's rules you have to follow, but there's no rulers unless you say it's God or nature itself. But you don't have to picture God as just a person. You can picture it as the intelligence or the laws of the universe in the case of nature, or how things just operate in the universe. And that's sort of reflective of the creator if there be a person anyways. Okay, so either way. And of course, there's going to be natural chaos or problems within this world. I have a section dedicated to that in my book called Natural Problems. And that chaos basically happens in the micro scale, in the macro worldview of freedom. Meaning that there's always going to be problems. No one's denying that there's always going to be immorality. The question is, how much immorality can we prevent? How much can we reduce? And to be honest, the only way you stop evil from aggregating is by not having governments, because evil will seek positions of power and authority in order to be exempted from the wrongdoing, and that's exactly what authority is by definition, is the exemption to morality, if you break it down and if you study the nature of statism. Okay, not a lot of people are willing to do that, but there's a lot of resources on my channel and at theliberator.us. I recommend checking it out. Sign up for the newsletter, and you'll be able to see a resources page with a bunch of great resources going over the history of governments and everything in between. But anyways, both chaos and order teaches us of each other, because again, we don't just want to look at the wrong thing for what is teaching us what is right. They both teach us each other, and that's how you have the whole concept of order, is there needs to be some fluctuation, some disturbances, so you then understand what is right. So everything sort of just works together. And so, fear, if you fear the natural chaos and you fear those natural problems, as I mentioned, you fear the fact that there's people who will potentially do wrongdoing. I mean, what are you going to do about it? Because there's always going to be people who do wrong things. You're actually living in a dreamlike illusion, utopian reality to think, oh, well, there will never be crime if we create this system of government. There'll never be crime if we do this or that. Because in reality, you're fearing nature if you're fearing the natural chaos, fearing the natural problems that will happen inevitably, because that is just human nature for people to learn and do bad things. And really, it's not that they're a bad person, it's that they've gone through bad experiences that make them do bad actions. And that's why we can take that non-resistant point of view and say, man, we don't just have to condemn them or do violence upon them, because that's how they got there in the very first place. Maybe they need to go through a real self-healing process, and that means welcoming them and giving them a reaction that they wouldn't have expected. Okay, so again, tying that back into non-resistance. So the fear of nature is the fear of freedom, and the fear of nature is also the fear of the natural chaos that exists. And if you recognize that there's a voluntary order that humans can create, that is voluntarism, people coming together. And embracing that voluntary order of people coming together is our matter of knowledge, because we know that people can work together without violence. We know people can work together without slavery. In fact, we do it most of the time in our lives, and most people don't want to be coerced into doing something that they don't want to do. So we see this as not just loving to embrace in the very first place, but when we embrace it, we also see flourishing coming from it, because people then do what they want, and there's less conflict, less chaos. Okay, so when you have the imagination to see this world of freedom, this world without government, it's also using our childlike nature, which we cannot really remove from ourselves, because we need to have imagination. It's part of who we are. If we destroy the imagination or the idea of there could be a better reality, we basically are saying, man, well, there's nothing we can do. It's hopeless, and man, there's nothing we can create to make things better. And in fact, let's not create at all. I'm not saying humans should not create at all, because man-made things can be problems. I'm saying man should align to nature. You can imagine without lying to yourself. You can imagine without, living a total fantasy of thinking, oh, unicorns and rainbows and all this stuff. You can totally imagine, and you can imagine a better reality with the knowledge that you have, or say, wait, how is this possible? And what would this do? And how does this react? And what is required for this, right? This is all the matter of imagination, and yet you're not living in a fantasy world. So important that we use our imagination and find a time and place for that too. And realize that there is no necessary violence. There is no necessary denaturing. Because denaturing, by definition, is not necessary. It's unnatural. It's an illusion. It's not something that you need to live with. So somebody saying, I need this phone with me, I need this thing, it's like a body part, it's attached to me. You don't need it, okay? You thinking it's necessary is a problem because you're now ignoring nature. You're in ignorance. And so realize that denaturing is not naturalizing. And naturalizing versus denaturing is another concept within Naturosophy, which is another way to just say what promotes the natural versus what promotes the unnatural, okay? Again, naturalizing what supports or gives to the natural, and denaturing what steals from or violates the natural, okay? That's essentially the same exact concept. And so when people are following orders, they're basically robots. And if you look up the etymology of robot, you get slave, right? And that slave mindset is not somebody using their own nature. It's somebody being completely controlled. There's a reason why we look at robots and we say that's not natural, like that's not a natural being, or it feels better to talk to somebody who is free-minded, who speaks to me, who looks at me with care and as a human being, because we care about that. We realize love cannot come from robots the same way it does from human beings. We realize there's a natural connection we have to this universe that AI and robots cannot replace. And so people live in this slave mindset and they follow orders thinking that they're doing the right thing, but in reality, it's actually doing the opposite and making matters much, much worse. So the slave mindset really is people taking away their own nature and becoming robots, giving in to a system of artificial reality. So conscience and empathy and intuition, these are all the same thing, and they're part of your nature, and you need to use it, and you cannot ignore it. And because if you ignore these things, then again, you are allowing denaturing, which is the lack or the disregard, the stealing or the violating. These are the same thing. If you're stealing something, you don't have it, it's a lack. If you lack the ability to speak, you're not able to speak. You don't have that ability anymore. Right? If you disregard the ability to speak, well, then you have the lack of it as well. You're violating the fact that you could speak in the case of disregarding or ignoring it, right? And again, denaturing is all just the attempt to lack, the attempt to disregard, the attempt to steal and violate. But what was there first is what denaturing relies on. Denaturing does not create anything new. Evil does not create anything new. It relies on nature to take from, to steal from, to ignore from, okay? Again, it's not giving to anything, it's stealing from. And by stealing from, it can try to provide for another, giving the illusion like it's giving you something, like government does. Every time it gives somebody a benefit, it sounds like, wow, okay, this is something I should use, yeah, insurance or whatever, healthcare. But that doesn't make it right, because it was given to you by this man-made authority. How they get the money to give you that benefit? Maybe it was because it was stolen from somebody else. Everything government gives you has been stolen from somebody else. And so understanding all this, which is using your conscience, empathy, intuition, and all words, again, representing a similar concept, using it, not ignoring it, using your nature, is realizing from all these concepts, nature always wins. And everyone is responsible. So no one person is, solely responsible. Like we look at the slide, order giver or order follower. Yeah, the order follower takes the order and puts into action, but guess what? They're both responsible. They're both responsible. We have to realize that everyone's responsible, but only you are you, and you own your actions, so you have to own up to your own actions, and by doing so, you prove your ownership, because you're owning up to your ownership. And the reason why everyone is responsible is because we have a shared reality. We make it with each other. We can stop each other from doing certain actions. We can help each other for doing certain actions. So everyone's responsible, whether it's the order giver, the order follower, the people on the sidelines. Everyone is there. Everyone is responsible. To say only few people are responsible is wrong, because I could make the attempt to say, hey, the order giver, he should stop telling everybody, going around telling somebody to do something, because eventually somebody will probably do it. Someone really naive. So yeah, order followers, they're definitely the evils of this world because they're the ones actually carrying it out. But I still want to appeal to the order givers because they're still going to walk around finding whoever they can find to do their bidding. And if they're promoting something evil, it's evil, right? And so I don't want any evil to continue. And I don't care who it's coming from, the order giver or the order follower. I don't want it to continue because it's evil. So understand the core role that your responsibility in nature is to maintain your nature, to use your nature, otherwise you will lose it. That is the common phrase I say. And so, let's say we want to talk about self-loathing. This is a mental condition. If you have a broken nature, you're lacking something within yourself, and you don't respect yourself, you don't love yourself, and therefore you can't embrace yourself, basically you aren't living your own life, you are self-loathing, which is this projection. Okay, it's a man-made authority because you're projecting your problems that you had at a very young age, maybe traumas that you had, onto other people. And it's broken because, again, you're lacking something. You're lacking the self-respect. You're lacking the care, which is why the only solution to self-loathing is self-respect. It can help put the order follower on the path to conscience. The order follower is broken because he's a robot. He's not being his natural self. So in order to repair this broken nature is to provide. And to provide is by giving, and you have to give respect. Who's giving respect to yourself? You, because you are the one who doesn't like yourself. So in order to like yourself, you have to like yourself. But how do you have self-respect? Perhaps you have to respect your nature and who you are, and that's why you have to look in the mirror and see, who am I? Who am I really? What am I trying to be? Who am I really trying to be? Because then you'll see, what are you projecting? What are you putting on others? What are you lacking? What do you need more of? Maybe you need less, actually. More of less. And so it's all about looking at adequacy, which is the same word for capacity. Realizing you can know, realizing you can harmonize with nature. And this is the matter of empowerment. Being able to realize your power, that you are adequate, that you are able to live in nature with your natural capabilities. And many people will believe, no, I'm not able to do that. Man, I have to follow orders, man. I have to project onto others. There's no other way. This is what makes me happy. But you're never going to be truly happy unless you respect yourself and your nature and you see the adequacy within yourself. So to empower yourself without dependency, without falling to instinct, and being able to truly see life for what it is, which, starts with yourself. I mean, if there's any one thing you're going to know the most of, it has to be yourself. Because only you are living yourself, right? So knowledge is what helps you say no when someone tells you to do something. Knowledge helps you say no, and ignorance makes you say yes. Yes, I'll follow orders, but knowledge says no, I'm not going to follow orders because I know what to do. So you know to say no. This is the lost word, Mark Passio says. Very, very important that you know when to say no. But again, you can look at this and say, well, when should you say yes? When should you say no? These are all understanding time and place. Knowing what to say, knowing how to act, knowing what to do, knowing what to create an existence, to keep an existence, this is all time and place. And when we talk about the one great work, which is the role of teachers and natural law teachers sharing this knowledge to the world, it's not limited to just the one great work. For instance, I even create a movement called Nature is the Answer. There's Freedom Cells, there's Larkin Rose and what he's doing, and the Most Dangerous Superstition, and there's movies and all this stuff. You can say that's all part of the one great work, but it doesn't have to be called the one great work. It doesn't have to be done a certain set way. Find a way that works for you because you live in a certain environment with certain people, and they need to see certain things, and some people have a grasp on certain things but don't have a grasp on other things. The yin and the yang, everything needs to be balanced. You need to be able to see it, just like the scale of justice you see on the screen. Same thing with yin and yang. You have to be able to find that balance. Some people are more flexible than others. Some people have better joints than others. And it's all just a matter of coming to that balance, which everybody can achieve. It's just a matter of if they know how to achieve it. Everything's a matter of that knowledge. So again, truth is nature. So apocalypse, if we look at apo, it means deocculting. And if we are deocculting or bringing something out of hiding and revealing it, okay, All we're doing is recognizing what was all along, what was already there, because it was there for us to see all this time. And if it was there all along, recognizing what was all along, that is nature. It's the only thing it can be to reveal, because it is nature that people use over other people's nature, keeping that knowledge away from them to keep them in ignorance, because they realize that's the only evil. But if you keep and share that knowledge of nature to everyone, you're revealing it to them. You're being able to show them the reality they live in, and therefore they can harmonize with it. And therefore they can empower themselves. So use your nature and know your place. That's how I'm going to summarize this whole presentation. Do you have to admit to yourself being wrong? Yes, but you have to use your nature and know your place. This is all the process of learning, all the process of knowledge. And you'll realize what I haven't been using. You realize what places you shouldn't have been in, and you will make those apologies as necessary. So thank you very much for watching. This is Corey Angelot. Nature is the answer. And if you want more information about Naturosophy, go to nita.one/naturosophy, nita.one/naturosophy. You can also find some of my books and other resources on that. Would recommend some of their interviews if you need even more information about it. Of course, the guidebook is great for people to start off with, since it has a bunch of questions. You can even use it as a curriculum. Thank you.